BBC News at 6 with Jane Hill in the studio and Clive Myrie in Kyiv.
Tonight at 6, we're live in Ukraine as Russian troops are reported to have entered Kyiv's northern suburbs. The government calls on citizens to help defend the capital. Areas of the city came under a barrage of airstrikes and explosions overnight, damaging apartment blocks and cratering the streets. Large crowds of frightened people gather at Kyiv's railway station to try to flee the city. Video posted on social media shows Russian armored vehicles entering the capital as NATO condemns Russia's military action.
President Putin's decision to pursue his aggression against Ukraine is a terrible strategic mistake, for which Russia will pay a severe price for years to come.
As the fighting continues and damage is revealed, Ukraine's president says his people are alone in defending the country, while President Putin urges Ukrainians to turn on their own leaders. These are the lucky ones, the Ukrainians, now refugees who've escaped to safety in their thousands across the border with Poland.
I love my country. I want to go back, but we cannot stay safe over there.
And Paris is named as the new location for the Champions League final as Russia's decision to invade Ukraine sees it stripped of a number of major sporting events. We'll be reporting from across Ukraine and talking to our correspondents in Moscow, Beijing, Brussels and at Westminster.
And stay with us on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Good evening and welcome to a specially extended 6 o'clock news from the Ukrainian capital Kyiv, with some Russian troops now in the northern parts of the city. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged the army to stand firm in the face of Russian aggression, saying the West has left his nation to fight on its own. And he's urging civilians to help defend the country. All men aged 18 to 60 could be called up to fight. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has appealed to the Ukrainian military to turn on their own government and seize power. Let's take a look at some of the key moments on day 2 of the Russian invasion. Well, Ukrainian officials say Russian troops have now entered the outskirts of Kyiv, closing in on the capital. They're possibly no more than 20 kilometers from the heart of the city. Overnight explosions could be heard. Exact figures are unknown, but there are reports of large numbers of Ukrainian military and civilian casualties, and reports of hundreds of Russian military deaths. Streams of people in cars or on foot have been fleeing the fighting, heading for neighbouring countries including Poland and Romania. The UN Refugee Agency believes up to 5 million people are trying to leave. And there's fierce fighting reported right across the country, with Russian troops advancing from the north, the east, and from Crimea in the south. But all eyes are on Kyiv here, where there have been firefights in a northern suburb as Ukrainian forces engage an advance party of Russian troops. The government here says 18,000 machine guns have been handed out to volunteers who want to defend the capital, while Russia claims it's taken control of the Hostomel airfield to the northwest of Kyiv, important for international cargo and a key military airbase. Well, in the first of our reports tonight, our correspondent Nick Beak looks at the latest developments on the day Kyiv came under attack.
The early sirens wailed in Ukraine's capital once more. But this was no rude awakening. No one had been able to sleep. The latest Russian bombardments had hit yet more homes, injuring the very civilians the Kremlin promised had nothing to fear from what it calls a targeted attack on the Ukrainian military. As we make our way through Kyiv, we find volunteers now bearing arms to protect their country. We soon see signs of a battle drawing ever nearer. as well as those bracing themselves for a last stand. Of all the places to get a flat tire, Alina's family now caught between Ukrainian artillery and the Russian front line. Elena says the whole family is very afraid and can't now go back to their home. And this is why. What do you think of what Vladimir Putin is doing to the Ukrainian people?
Що ви думаєте, що Путін робить
This is him, Elena's mother tells me. You can hear the artillery. That is outgoing fire from Ukrainian forces. That family has just left. The fear here is that very soon Russian forces will be making their way down here to take the capital. At the same time, Ukraine's president was trying to reassure a nation, pleading with the world to help them.
For the second day, our cities experience rocket and bomb strikes, masses of tanks, as well as airstrikes, which are similar to those which Europe has already seen during the Second World War, and about which it said, never again. But this is now how it is. It happens again.
President Putin urged the military he was attacking to turn on their own government.
I appeal to the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. Do not let neo-Nazis and Ukrainian ultra-nationalists use your children, wives and the elderly as human shields. Take power into your own hands.
Ukraine is under attack on many fronts. In Mariupol, in the southeast, destruction. In Sumy, in the northeast, battles rage. And here in the capital, in circumstances still unclear, horror as a tank drives over a car. Incredibly, the driver survived. And this is a pivotal battleground, an airport northwest of Kyiv. Its fate could be vital to that of the whole country. If the Russians succeed there, this will be one of the first neighborhoods they come through, Podil. Today, it looks like any other in Ukraine. This queue is for the pharmacy. Maxim tells us he hopes any advancing Russians would not harm him and his family.
I think they don't take our normal people. I think they have heart inside. They have something good inside.
Elena, a grandmother, says Russian occupation would be a disaster.
This is my city, the city of my parents, my grandparents. I'm not going to leave.
And as for what she makes of Vladimir Putin,
when a person is so inadequate, nobody knows what will come to his mind.
Tonight, there is overwhelming support for the men and women being asked to save their country. But there's also a deep fear the effort will not be enough. Nick Beak, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, as you heard there's been fighting right across Ukraine, but for some in areas awaiting any Russian advance, they're making last-minute preparations for battle. Our Eastern Europe correspondent Sarah Rainsford reports now from the city of Dnipro, strategically important, situated on a river dividing east and west Ukraine. Sarah.
Well, yes, Clive, it's just a couple of hours now to the curfew here in this city, so the streets are emptying out, the shops and the restaurants already closed, people rushing back to their homes for the night. The fighting hasn't directly affected this city at this point, but certainly there are Russian troops, Russian tanks fighting to the south, to the north and to the east of here, trying to push through to take more ground. And so people here are nervous, and in just 2 days of conflict, their lives have already begun to change.
This is not normal, but it is life now for Anna and her family, ever since Vladimir Putin launched his invasion. The boys don't go to school anymore. Everyone's home, waiting for the war to reach them.
So these small are for kids.
If there's shelling, they're ready to run to the basement.
Just basic stuff like warm clothes, a bottle of water and a snack. I have to keep up my smile for the kids because they are very nervous. They cried yesterday. They're scared. I'm scared for my life, for my kids. I'm scared for my country. But this is, the fear that is transformed into anger that makes you act, do something to defend your country and to protect yourself.
This is Dnipro, and by daylight things are calm for now. But at 10 p.m, a siren sounds and the street's empty. Until then, there's queues everywhere for cash. The city straddles the vast river that divides Ukraine into east and west. Its bridges reportedly prepped for destruction if Russian tanks get close. The local blood donor centre's working flat out, collecting supplies for any soldiers wounded on the front line. There's been war here in eastern Ukraine for 8 years, but what's happening now is on a whole new scale.
This is a huge queue, and people have been standing here all day coming to give blood because they say they want to do their bit to help their armed forces. But the thing that I keep hearing from people in this queue is that they also want the West to do more to help their country.
Sanctions are okay, it helps, and I believe that it will help a lot, but yeah, we need more. That's not enough. We really rely on Europe now. My friend is going there now.
Your friend has to go and fight with Russia?
Yeah, and I don't want to lose them. I don't want to lose my country. I love it so much, you can't even imagine that.
How worried are you about what's happening at this invasion?
Actually, it is quite shocking for me, and right now I'm thinking about taking weapon to my hands, at least to defend my local districts.
Ukraine's now called on everyone to help defend this land as Russian troops fight their way forward across a country nervous but determined to resist them. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News in eastern Ukraine.
Well, this evening, President Zelensky posted a message on social media telling his country that and his presidential team are standing firm.
Всім добрий вечір. Лідер фракції тут, голова Офісу президента тут, прем'єр-міністр Швейцарії тут.
On the streets of Kiev, he said, the citizens are here. We are here to defend our independence. Glory to our defendants. Glory to Ukraine. Okay, let's talk to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who's with me. The suggestion is, certainly from the Pentagon, that Russian troops, Russian armor, are within 20 kilometers of the capital here. The fighting could get right into the heart of the city.
It really feels ominous here in the center of Kiev. You can only call this an existential crisis for the people of Ukraine, including the people of Kiev. Life seems to have drained from what was a vibrant European city. Even the golden domes of St. Michael's Cathedral are no longer shining in the night. The foreign ministry behind us has gone dark, and when you go out into the streets of the city, I just came back, it is like a ghost town. It seemed all the people have gone underground. They've gone into the bomb shelters, they've gone into the underground. But there's two conflicting rhythms here. One is there was one intersection when I was in the north of Kiev, and there was the screeching of luggage as people had their luggage wheelies, and they were dragging them away as fast as they could, groups of people fleeing. But going in the other direction was a long queue of men of all ages queuing up to sign up to volunteer to fight. And I said to one medical student, do you have any experience? He goes, no, I'm just going to fight. And I said, but you're taking on the Russian mighty army. He said, we're going to win. At a moment like this, there's bravado, and perhaps at a time when President Putin is telling them, you don't have a right to exist. Ukraine is a fake country. Ukrainians feel they must be as Ukrainian as possible.
Indeed. Okay, Lise, for now, many thanks. Lise Doucette there. Well, NATO leaders have called Russia's invasion of Ukraine a terrible strategic mistake for which it will pay a severe political and economic cost for years to come. NATO has been holding an extraordinary summit, which also included Finland, Sweden and the EU to discuss the latest developments. Turkey told the meeting that the alliance should have responded to the invasion more decisively. In America, President Biden says he's targeting Russia's largest banks and state-owned companies, cutting them off from Western financial markets and freezing trillions of dollars in assets. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports on the global response to the crisis here.
This is what the defence of Kiev looks like. Soldiers with guns and armoured vehicles ready to take on the might of Russian tanks and warplanes. Little wonder there's a debate about what more the West can do to help. But these American fighter jets won't be coming to their aid. They arrived in Romania today as part of NATO's decision to beef up its presence in member states close to Russia. So too these British forces arriving in the Baltic state of Estonia. They're there to deter potential Russian aggression against NATO countries. At the headquarters of the military alliance in Brussels, world leaders agreed to go even further, making what they called significant additional defensive deployments in Eastern Europe.
We are deploying elements of the NATO response force on land, at sea and in the air to further strengthen our posture and to respond quickly to any contingency. There must be no space for miscalculation or misunderstanding. We will do what it takes to protect and defend every ally and every inch of NATO territory.
What the West could do is give Ukraine more help like this. These are anti-tank weapons provided by Britain. Downing Street said more support was planned and nothing was off the table. There's clearly a strong appetite here at Westminster and in other European capitals to give Ukraine more military kit to support an insurgency against Russian forces. But ministers are absolutely clear. There'll be no UK troops on the ground, nor a no-fly zone enforced by NATO warplanes.
But we must all in this House be clear that British and NATO troops should not, must not play an active role in Ukraine. We must all be clear what the risks of miscalculation could be and how existential that could very quickly become if people miscalculate and things escalate unnecessarily.
And here's why. Ukraine might have held a parade for NATO forces last summer, but it's not yet a member. It wants to join, but that won't happen while there's a risk of importing conflict into the alliance, and that could take years to resolve. But look at how far and wide NATO reaches, and the fear is that if NATO forces join the fight in Ukraine, then war could spread across the whole continent.
An attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all members of NATO. The President's been very clear that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. I think that's the most powerful deterrent against President Putin going beyond Ukraine.
But that may be of little solace to the many thousands of people trying to flee Kiev station, where guards fired warning shots to keep back the crowds. Crowds choosing to head west rather than rely on the West. James Landau, BBC News.
I should say that in the last 10 seconds or so, we just heard an enormous bang, a loud sound just behind me, right over there on my right shoulder. Our cameraman Ian said he saw the flash. It could well be that we end up having to cut short this broadcast, but do stay with us. In a moment, we're going to hear from our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who's in Brussels. But first, let's talk to our North America editor, Sarah Smith, who's in Washington. Sarah, we've got a meeting of the UN Security Council tonight. How much further do you think the US are willing to go in its response?
Well, we know that President Biden has just come off the phone with President Zelensky of Ukraine, and they discussed strengthening sanctions and also concrete defence assistance for Ukraine. But we don't have any details of what that might look like yet. Personal sanctions against Vladimir Putin now have to be on the table for the US, but even that might not be enough for the Ukrainians, for some critics here in Congress, and also for a pro-Ukrainian demonstration that's happening just beside me here, where they are demanding stronger sanctions and assistance right now. As you say, there will be a meeting of the Security Council later. They will vote on a resolution that Russia should immediately withdraw from Ukraine. And the US have been working hard to try and get some countries who've not yet condemned Russian actions to come on board with that. Now, they know, of course, that motion will be vetoed by Russia, who's a permanent member of the Security Council. But they say it is the critical venue in which Russia must be forced to explain its actions. We've been getting some updates here from defence officials as well about what they believe is going on in Ukraine. They say a third of Russia's combat forces that have been assembled are now inside the country, and they continue to believe that the intention is to try and take the capital, Kyiv, and topple the government of Ukraine.
OK, Sarah, thank you for that. Sarah Smith there in Washington. Let's turn to Katja Adler in Brussels. Katja, NATO says it's beefing up its presence in the region, and there's news of tougher sanctions today.
Yes, a new sanctions package by the EU, including on its list of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, the EU says the whole package is hugely significant. Its biggest ever package aimed at causing short and longer term to the Russian economy. And the EU says preventing the Kremlin from being able to carry out for a long time its acts of aggression. But when it comes to Mr. Putin and Lavrov, it's perhaps more symbolic than significant. We're talking about an asset freeze here, and you have to ask, how many assets does Vladimir Putin really have in his own name in Europe? And it's interesting, the two men have not been slapped as other individuals on the EU sanctions list with a travel ban. EU diplomats say that's so that they can freely travel to a peace conference, but that note of optimism really jars, obviously, with the ugly reality on the ground, Clive, as you know. And that is why the EU already, before the ink is dry on this second sanction package, is under pressure to come up with a third and even tougher one, possibly excluding Russia from SWIFT, the financial transaction system. But Germany and Italy, with their close ties to Russia, dependence on gas, worried that could hit their economies as much or even more than the Kremlin.
OK, Katja, thank you for that. Katja Adler there live in Brussels, and Sarah Smith in Washington. Thanks to you too. Well, what's the mood in Russia? Our Moscow correspondent, Caroline Davies, has been to Belgorod, a city near Ukraine's eastern border, to hear the opinions of some of those there on the invasion.
The roads to Ukraine are icy and quiet. Through the snow-laden fog, we spot them.
We're about 20 miles away from the Ukrainian border here. This is one of the main roads between Belgorod in Russia up the road and Kharkiv down there in Ukraine as well. And we've seen plenty of military vehicles along this route, including here where we've seen some military vehicles parked up behind.
Driving around Belgorod, the signs of Russia's military action are obvious, from trucks, armoured vehicles, to sections of missile launchers. In the centre of the city, many tell us that they've heard the sounds of an assault overhead in the last 24 hours. Some repeat President Putin's rhetoric.
The president explained it all, that they will target military objects only. Of course, it's unpleasant, but there was no other way out.
There's already evidence that non-military targets have been hit in Ukraine. Others are not reassured. Leanna's home is 1 kilometre from the border. She's pregnant and worried about her family.
Of course we got frightened. For now we decided to move to Belgorod. We don't have any idea what is going on.
There is nothing good in it. Everyone has friends and relatives there. I can't find words to express it.
Today, Moscow seemed initially open to talks with Kyiv to discuss Ukraine adopting a neutral stance. But Russia's repetition of unsubstantiated accusations leaves little room for diplomacy.
It is not possible to consider as democratic a government which is oppressing its people and subjecting them to genocide.
A recent poll showed that the majority of Russians believe that the US and NATO countries are to blame for the escalation in Ukraine. But some have protested despite the risk of arrest. Others showed their dissent with small acts of defiance. Taken on the Moscow metro, this woman has written "No to War" on her bag. In western Russia, equipment continues to head to the border. The Kremlin shows no sign of changing paths.
Despite being only under half an hour away from the border, there is no sense of panic here, Clive. But it's obvious that this is weighing on people's minds. Now, the state media machine is in full swing, but it's yet to persuade everybody that President Putin was right to make this decision.
Again, in the last few minutes, we're getting the sounds of what we think are missiles right behind me, lighting up the night sky. As we've been saying throughout the program, the suggestion is that Russian forces are within 20 kilometers of the center of Kyiv. I mean, America says that, in fact, 200 missile launches, cruise and ballistic, have so far been observed in the battle for Ukraine, but Russia has still to capture any highly populated areas. Well, our defense correspondent Jonathan Beale assesses the military strategy and what might come next.
Russia's armoured columns are still rolling, but they're also taking casualties. This day two of their unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign democratic country. Russian units have moved in from multiple directions, from the north, east and from the south. Their most significant advance so far is from Belarus to the capital, Kyiv. Russia now says it's captured the airport of Hostomel, 20 miles to the north of the city, despite Ukrainian efforts to retake it. Russian troops have also now entered the suburbs of Kyiv itself, in Obolon, to the north of the city. They're also reported to be advancing from the east, but British military intelligence assesses that Russian forces have so far made limited progress, and they've been meeting fierce resistance.
The Russian advance has been slower than expected for multiple reasons. I don't think that they've used their artillery in the same way that they would, and they have quite a lot of axes of advance to prioritise. I also think a key part of it is that they are facing very stiff Ukrainian resistance, which I don't think they expected.
So what is Russia's final objective? It's now clear that Russian troops want to seize the capital, Kyiv, the centre of government. But is Russia's end goal to take the entire country, which is bigger than France? Remember, Russia had around 190,000 troops on the border, enough for an invasion, but military experts question that's enough to occupy the whole of Ukraine. The Dnieper River bisects Ukraine and forms a natural barrier, and Russian attacks are so far focused in the east. So is their goal to take all the territory east of the river? It would certainly give Russia one of its objectives, a land bridge to Crimea, which it invaded in 2014.
If Mr. Putin's intent was to occupy the whole of Ukraine with a force of 150,000, that would only conceivably work if it had the consent of the population of Ukraine, and it will not. A force of 150,000 is sufficient to defeat the Ukrainian military pretty much wherever it is, but it is not sufficient to occupy by compulsion a country of that size with that number of people who reject their presence. This may be a major miscalculation.
This is just the evidence of Ukraine's resistance outside Kharkiv, its second largest city, and just 30 miles from the Russian border. If President Putin really wants to conquer the entire country, has he tried to bite off more than he can chew? Jonathan Beale, BBC News.
In a moment, we'll be live in Beijing with Stephen McDonnell and in Moscow with our correspondent Steve Rosenberg, who's there. But first, let's talk to Ian Watson at Westminster. Ian, some pretty grim warnings were made there today.
That's right, Clive. We're hearing, of course, that the Russian forces are not making quite as much progress as they would have wished. And Western officials have been telling me that their fear is that there's now significant concern that Vladimir Putin will use any force necessary to achieve his objectives, including the indiscriminate use of artillery. There's also a feeling here at Westminster that we could be facing a protracted period of insurgency once Russia finally takes some of these cities, and that could be brutal and it could be bloody. There are calls from Conservative MPs as well as for the opposition now for sanctions to be ratcheted up and for more material to be sent to Ukrainian forces. And tonight, Boris Johnson has told NATO that he will sanction Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister directly. That's something which is very much in line with the EU. He'll also be pushing too for tougher sanctions in the next few days, which will please some of his MPs. But as you can see behind me, the London Eye is lit up with the colours of the Ukrainian flag in solidarity. What people on the ground seem to want is a lot more than that.
OK, Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow. We heard from Vladimir Putin, Steve, a little earlier, calling for Ukrainians to rise up against their own government. What do you make of that?
Yeah, quite extraordinary, Clive. I mean, only yesterday Vladimir Putin's message to Ukrainian servicemen was lay down your weapons and go back to your families. And today it's very different. It's rise up, seize power, and we can do a deal with you. In other words, a direct call for a military uprising in Ukraine, a direct call for regime change. Talking of change, it's beginning to feel like what happened yesterday has changed everything for Ukraine, for Europe, and for Russia. You know, this country sees itself as a great power, but it risks becoming a pariah. It's facing this wave of new Western sanctions, and you can feel that the barriers, the new walls going up. I mean, the Russian Grand Prix cancelled, St. Petersburg scrapped as the venue for the Champions League final, and Eurovision, Russia kicked out of the Eurovision Song Contest. As one Russian journalist said to me yesterday, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Russians had their future taken away from them because the world will turn its back on Russia.
And to you, Stephen, in Beijing, how do you think all this is going down there? Because we know that perhaps the sanctions on Vladimir Putin and Russia could be softened because China will take up the slack.
Well, officially at least, China has neither endorsed nor criticised Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, many people will see a phone call today with Vladimir Putin speaking to Xi Jinping as a form of support. I mean, you think about it, in the middle of a war, there are the two leaders having a chat, discussing how things are going in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin blames NATO and the US for causing the crisis there in this call, and we're told that Xi Jinping then speaks about the need to recognise the legitimate security concerns of certain countries, i.e. Russia. Now, I say that China hasn't criticised the invasion of Ukraine. Actually, the Chinese Foreign Ministry rejects the use of the word invasion for what's going on there, and instead has said that the door's open for a political solution, but without telling us how they could reach that political solution.
Fascinating. OK, Steve McDonnell in Beijing, Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, and Ian Watson at Westminster. Many thanks to you all. I should tell you that if you're tuning in for the BBC News, where you are, it will follow this programme at 7 o'clock. Now, Ukraine's President Zelensky has urged the European Union to impose tougher sanctions on Russia. Today, as we've been hearing, EU finance ministers have been meeting to agree fresh sanctions, which are expected to include asset freezes directly targeting Vladimir Putin and the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov for the very first time. Our business editor Simon Jack reports on the impact those sanctions might have.
Yesterday, Russian airline Aeroflot was banned from UK skies. Today, BA was banned from Russia, a reminder that in economic warfare there's an exchange of fire. Sanctions are the weapons the West has chosen, and the UK has laid out its arsenal so far. The 10-point plan also includes freezing Russian banks' UK assets, banning the Russian state or companies from raising money on UK markets, sanctioning 100 companies and individuals, which would include travel bans to the UK, and placing a £50,000 limit on UK bank deposits for Russian nationals. So how powerful a package is this, and what might be the collateral damage?
These sanctions are very significant. The financial relationship between the UK and Russia has been severed, and that will significantly impact the Russian economy and Russian financial institutions, but it will also affect companies in the UK, because companies in the UK who thought they were going to be exporting, I don't know, whiskey to Russia next week will suddenly find that their bank will no longer process that payment. So I don't think we've yet really thought through the consequences of what this means for UK industry.
The UK, France and others have also called for Russia to be excluded from the SWIFT system. It's a network of 11,000 financial firms in 200 countries that facilitate international payments. It's considered among the most damaging sanction that could be imposed, but again, it's not without cost to others. Slap bang opposite the Bank of England is this building, home to VTB, Russia's second biggest bank. Now, pulling firms like this out of SWIFT would be disruptive for Russia for sure, but it would also come at a heavy cost to those companies and countries owed money either now or in financial contracts by Russian companies. It's particularly true of Germany, who have a deep financial relationship with Russia and use the system to pay for 2/3 of their gas supply. That's one reason Germany has so far been reluctant to pull the trigger on SWIFT, though that may change. The conflict and the sanctions will add fuel to inflation, and not just at the petrol pump and in our energy bills.
Well, Russia and Ukraine are major exporters, not just of oil and gas, but actually foodstuffs, wheat, fertilizers. So that's going to impact the broad food chain. I think it's highly likely now in the UK we'll see inflation reach 8%, which is a number we haven't seen in 30 years.
Russia has over $600 billion in reserves to tough this out, and it's a grim paradox that the higher prices for oil and gas rise, the more the countries dependent on it fuel the very Russian war machine they are trying to stop. Simon Jack, BBC News.
The invasion of Ukraine is having a direct impact on the world of sport. UEFA has moved the Champions League final from St. Petersburg to Paris, and Formula One has cancelled the Russian Grand Prix. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has the latest on that.
Sport has long been used by Vladimir Putin as a means of projecting Russian power. But today it began to apply pressure on the president as an exodus of major events from the country began. Earlier, St. Petersburg was stripped of May's Champions League final. UEFA now looking at how to end its lucrative deal with the competition's title sponsor Gazprom. The Russian state-controlled energy giant pays the governing body tens of millions of pounds a year. But the stadium that bears its name has now lost club football's showpiece event.
This is just an incredible situation that we have that kind of war within Europe. And therefore, I think the decision that UEFA took was inevitable, and it was the right decision.
Manchester United have had to make a decision themselves over their official airline carrier, Aeroflot. Today, the club terminating its long-standing multi-million-pound partnership with the Russian national airline after it was banned from operating in the UK. After years of close association, the world of sport starting to turn on Russia. With Russia due to play a World Cup playoff match next month, UEFA today ordered all its clubs and national teams to play their home matches away from the region.
Withdrawing sports events may hurt even more than the financial sanctions, because this has a huge impact on public opinion. And, you know, imagine Russia do qualify and they're banned, then this will have a massive negative impact for Russian government. So they'll be weighing that up as well.
But just how tough will FIFA be? After all, its president accepted the Order of Friendship medal from Putin after the Russia World Cup. So will he now return it?
My thoughts are really on all the people who are affected by this escalating conflict and nothing else.
Meanwhile, Formula One has confirmed the Russian Grand Prix, due to be held in Sochi in September, is off. Skiing's governing body also pulling its events in the country. And this afternoon, all federations urged to follow suit by the International Olympic Committee. The world of sport sending the Russian regime a clear message, its isolation intensifying. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
More on the human cost of the invasion now. The UN's refugee agency says more than 50,000 people have fled Ukraine in the past 48 hours. Many have headed west, attempting to cross the border into neighbouring countries. Now there's concern that the steady stream could turn into a torrent as more fighting continues. Well, our correspondent Mark Lowen is on the Polish border as Ukrainians there are trying to get out. Mark, over to you.
Clive, Poland's border with Ukraine is just down this road, and there's been a steady line of people crossing today. The Polish authorities say that 25,000 people crossed this border into Ukraine in the first half of the day alone. But it's been mainly women and children coming because the men have been conscripted back at home to fight. Poland has now set up 9 reception centres along this border as the EU begins to feel the impact of Russia's aggression.
A border separates, but also brings together. Families reunited in the search for safety, like 10-year-old Maria and her mother, who travelled for 2 days from Kiev to join her father here in Poland. How do you feel about leaving? Do you feel scared about what is happening?
Yes.
I have never thought about
this situation that one day another country in the 21st century could attack another country in Europe.
Your country?
My country.
The stream of Ukrainians crossing this border is increasing. They've lived with the threat from Russia for years, but now, with its leader besieging their homes, they've had to flee. Nadia Slusarenko left her eldest daughter behind to help the army, coming here with her two youngest.
Yesterday I woke up because I've heard some noise and I asked my husband, what is happening? He just looked through the window and said, wow, Russians bombed our airport. So, okay, just pack our bags and you have to save the kids. I love my country. I want to go back. But we cannot stay safe over there.
Poland is welcoming the new arrivals with open arms and is setting up several reception centres. It's been one of the EU's most hardline anti-migrant countries in recent years, but it also knows all too tragically the cost of Russian occupation and hostility.
These scenes of seeking refuge across Europe's borders are more associated with the migrant crisis from the Middle East. But now the threat is on the EU's doorstep. And while Poland says that the uptick in arrivals so far is modest, it warns that it could become the largest refugee wave since 2015.
There's traffic in the other direction too. Ukrainians Andriy and Mykolai heading back to help their homeland fight. We're going home to defend our country, he says. This is our duty. We didn't do anything wrong to Russia. Putin is trying to capture the whole of Ukraine. From wherever they came, they have one destination: safety. Yesterday they were residents. Today, refugees. Mark Lowen, BBC News, on the Poland-Ukraine border.
Well, the British government is being urged to establish safe routes for those trying to flee the fighting. A collection of major charities has urged ministers to lead the way in welcoming Ukrainians seeking sanctuary. The Home Office is now extending the visas of some already in the UK, but others are worried, as our home editor Mark Easton reports from Nottingham.
Nottingham's Ukrainian community, part of the city since they arrived as refugees fleeing Hitler's troops, is finding solace in communion. All talk of the agony of being unable to help their loved ones back in the homeland. Alina's parents and two sons are in part of Ukraine already occupied by Russian troops. Without internet or electricity, she has no idea what's happened to them.
I can't get information because exactly where the place for living for them, the house and everything, that is now occupied with Russian army and with Russian tanks.
It must be terrifying for you.
Of course it's terrifying because you don't have any peace of mind, a second rest.
Well, he set on this path 20 plus years ago.
At the Ukrainian Cultural Centre in Nottingham, people are also coming together in solidarity. Raising money, an online appeal's been set up, sharing news and offering support.
We are running out of everything there, of medicine, on blankets. We're not ready, we're not prepared because we didn't think it would happen.
Very important to feel the physical unity, to feel that you're not by yourself, you're not alone there, and together we can possibly do something.
We in the West, and I mean the whole of Western Europe, not just the UK, we owe Ukraine.
Do you think we should be putting troops on the ground in Ukraine?
I think NATO needs to look at itself.
Charities, including Save the Children, are urging the government to set up a safe route for refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. But the Home Office says Ukraine is not Afghanistan, and it's the government's long-standing position that those fleeing persecution should seek safety in the first safe country they reach. The reluctance of the government to set up an evacuation and resettlement programme for Ukrainians angers Nottingham Labour MP Nadia Whittam.
I think it's unforgivable. I've spoken yesterday morning with Ukrainian constituents who are distraught with worry for the safety of their family back home. The UK government has a responsibility to put direct support for people first.
The Home Secretary has said that Britain stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Some visas for Ukrainian citizens currently in the UK are being extended. But for the moment, the UK government does not wish to make any offer of sanctuary to those fleeing war in Europe. Mark Easton, BBC News, Nottingham.
Well, that's it for the moment. We'll have more from here in Kyiv a little later in the programme, but now I'll hand you back to the studio in London.